Hey everyone, good afternoon. I want to welcome you, or good morning if you're in the Midwest. I want to welcome you all to our discussion today. May 19th marks the day that we remember the more than 350,000 victims of a policy of genocide that was perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire and then the Republic of Turkey against the Greeks of Pondos. Their story is one part of the Greek genocide that began in 1914 and subsequently included all the Greeks that were living in the then Ottoman Empire. Today, we're going to discuss the genocide of the Pondian Greeks from a new angle, through the lens of U.S. naval officers and captains who were stationed off the coast of Pondos. Joining me to shed light on these stories are two distinguished guests that I'm very happy to have with us, Professor Robert Shank and Savas Koktzoglou, who will discuss their latest book, The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries. Naval commanders report and protest death marches in Turkey's Pondos region, 1921 to 1922. Before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to introduce each of our speakers. Dr. Shenk is a retired professor of English at the University of New Orleans, and as author and co-author, he has published 9 books, including a naval history titled America's Black Sea Fleet. Dr. Shenk is also a retired captain in the U.S. Naval Reserve, having seen duty in Vietnam. He is also on voluntary recall to active duty at both the Air Force Academy and the Naval Academy. Dr. Shank, or Bob, welcome to our program.
Thanks
And
very much.
and our next guest, many of you may know him if you're here in Chicago, is Savas Koktzoglou. For those of you who don't know Savas, or Sam, he's a retired mechanical engineer who has worked on a number of projects, both in the U.S. and in Greece. Prior to his engineering career, he served as a second lieutenant in the Greek Army Reserve Special Forces. He's an avid reader of history with a special interest in the history of Asia Minor, and a significant portion of the research in this book is a result of his tireless efforts photographing and finding many of these naval war diary entries at the National Archives. He's also a member of the Hellenic Link Midwest, an organization here in Chicago that showcases activities on a variety of topics that are at the forefront of the Hellenic American community's interest. Savas, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Thano. Thank you. I'd
Bob,
like to I'd like to thank you, both you and Andy, for having this interview, and also for the great work that you guys are doing for Hellenism in both the U.S. and Greece as well as Cyprus.
thank you very much, Sam. It's great to have you here, and it's great to have you here too as well, Professor Shank. Uh, I want to start off with you, Savas. As we mentioned at the outset of the program, the book covers a period of time during the Greek genocide. Before we get into the details of the book and the research and all the stories that we find in it, can you give us a brief background on the Greek genocide? When did it begin? What were some of the methods used by the Ottomans and by Kemal's forces in implementing it?
Well, the Greek genocide started in 1914 in Eastern Thrace and Western Asia Minor, or Ionia as we call, and continued after the war and culminated in 1921 and 1922. So that's pretty much, in other words, the span, the time span that it took for the Turks basically to exterminate the Greek population in Asia Minor. And the means were various. There were massacres, deportations, labor battalions, and various other means.
And we're talking essentially about a time, like you said, from 1914 to 1923 that affected the Greeks ranging from Eastern Thrace all the way to Asia, through Asia Minor and the Pondos region.
Correct, yes.
And this wasn't just a genocide of Greeks. We've seen at the same time a number of other Christian groups that were native to that area, including the Armenians and the Assyrians, who also suffered greatly. Bob, could you tell us a little bit about that?
well, the Armenians had been being killed by the Turks under the way back into the 1890s, but they continue to be the heat was turned up on the Armenians basically during World War I, 1915 and 1916. And I don't know as much about the Assyrians, but that was another difficulty. In any case, the Armenians were overall eventually almost eliminated by killings and massacres, although many of them also then ended up being taken out of the Ottoman Empire by in one way or another at the end of Smyrna and so on. So it was against all the Christians, an attempt to get rid of the Christians from, and the word Sam used, exterminate, is the word we find in the diaries again and again, to exterminate the Christians in Asia Minor.
Thank you for that recap. I think it's very informative as we move into the conversation about the book. And I want to get back to Sam now. Sam, you spent many hours heading over to the National Archives, photographing a number of these war diaries. But I'd love to know, how did you discover that there were these U.S. naval ships that were stationed off the coast of the Pontos area? What tipped you off and led to this search?
Well, many years ago, my father had a book that, in that book, there was a description of the destruction and the massacre that took place in his village in Turkey. It was a village nearby the port of Samsun, where the American destroyers were basically stationed. And so I read the description. In the description, there was a reference to the presence of an American destroyer in the harbor of Samsun. So, and it talked about the fact that the captain supposedly went on a fact-finding mission to the village after the massacre, and supposedly he wrote in his diary what he saw. So I figured, well, maybe one day, if I have time, I will seek this diary. And of course, I had a family, kids, work, and so forth and so on. So I never had a chance to do that until I retired. So at that point I said, well, let me go and take a look and see if I can find these diaries. And fortunately, there was a good friend of mine, Professor Harry Psomyadis of the University of New York, who directed me to the archives. He says, that's where you're going to find the Naval Archives. And as a result, I went to Washington, D.C. a couple of times, and I asked for the diaries. Of course, they brought me other things that I wasn't interested in, like the day-to-day log of the ship, which was not something that I was looking for. And then I asked, I said, no, there's got to be other documents, the diaries possibly of the captains. And they said, oh, okay, we know what you need. You want the war diaries. So I said, yeah, let me see those. So when they brought me, I guess, the diaries, they brought me these carts with these volumes. And I said, oh, let me look at these. So I started looking at this, and there it was, all these diaries, with the records of all the events that these American officers were witnesses of. So that's basically how it started, in other words.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you ended up working with Professor Shenk on this project?
Oh, yeah. When I came from Washington in the summer of 1912, after photographing the diaries, I went online and I see this book by somebody by the name Robert Shank, and it was the title of it was the America's Black Sea Fleet. And as I purchased it and I started looking into it, and I saw that he had two chapters. One was on Pontus, actually it was titled The Death in the Pontus, and another one on Smyrna. So I said, well, and I read those, and to my surprise, I saw a lot of information, good information, and very well written, in other words. Information that some of those actually were based on some of the diaries that I have photographed in Washington. Not very many, but there was enough, to give some picture of what was going on in the Pontus and Smyrna. Anyway, that's how I learned about Bob, and then we met at a conference in Chicago in 2013, and we started talking about possibly collaborating, and eventually it happened. In other words, we collaborated and produced this book.
Bob, you've written a book titled "The American Navy in the Black Sea," or the American Black Sea Fleet. Can you tell us a little bit about what was the role of the U.S. Navy in the Black Sea at the time, and why is it so important that we give this new angle to the story of the genocide through the lens of these U.S. naval officers that were stationed on the ships?
The role of the Navy was partly they were there to protect American citizens, and there were American missionaries and relief workers throughout Anatolia or Asia Minor, and so they were there to also to find out what was going on in the Armenian Genocide, which had great knowledge throughout the United States. Everybody knew of the Armenian Genocide. My mother told me many years later to eat my food because of the Armenians, the poor Armenians, starving Armenians, and so on. All of America was involved in that, and so they. So that's one reason that the American ships were there, but they were also doing other things. But still, the reason that it's important for us is that the Americans, it's a different angle, an earlier angle. These people were being deported and some massacred near Samsun, right in the Pontus, and the Navy ships were right there. They normally the Turks would take them outside of Samsun to do these things to them, but they also saw some of the people being deported. They reported them in their war diaries. They reported to the admiral. They reported also what the American tobacco businessmen said, who they were fluent in Turkish, had been there for years, about what was going on. Their former employees were telling them about the massacres and the various terrible things that were taking place. And so this was a new angle and a completely earlier account, even before those more well-known ones of the American relief workers. So the naval officers also had to decide what to do, because they were supposed to be neutral, but then they were seeing the terrible atrocities taking place right in front of them. So the question is, what do I do about this? They had to make a decision. They had to decide on what they do, because they're supposed to be neutral, but they have to at least report it, perhaps protest it personally, or perhaps ask their admiral to protest it. And that's, of course, as a naval officer, that's a very important angle here, is what the Navy was doing when they saw these terrible things taking place. It was probably the first genocide that the American Navy ever really witnessed.
Can you explain a little bit? I know you mentioned that it's a big responsibility for these naval officers who are supposed to remain neutral, but are torn apart. Their conscience is pulling them and telling them, we've got to do something. Can you tell us a little bit about what might be going through the mind of a naval officer who is encountering something like this, and then I'd love to get into a couple of the great examples of naval officers that we encounter in the book who did take action in the form of written protests to their admiral, and the results of those efforts. And I think there's a couple standout captains and officers that I'll ask about you after we get your answer.
Okay. One of the reasons it was so difficult for the American naval officers is they knew the admiral was pro-Turkish. He thought the best place for American business to be developed was with the nationalists, rather than with the Armenians and Greeks and so on, who were very good and also competitors at business. So early on, Admiral Bristol took a liking to the Turks, decided he would favor the Turks in his efforts, and he would often did downplay what was happening, these terrible things that were happening to the Armenians first and the Greeks later. So the naval officers then had a difficulty because their boss, their admiral, was going to not like what he was saying about the terrible things that were happening. All their war diaries, however, went to him, and so they had to be as good as they could be in reporting what is happening without being neutral. Well, the one fellow who had the most difficult problem, perhaps, was Admiral Roy Bristol. He was commander, and later Vice Admiral Roy Bristol, a wonderful man, a very, very outstanding naval officer, who had won a Navy Cross even in World War I before this all took place. So Admiral Bristol probably respected him because of his prior record, and so he could speak to the admiral perhaps as no one else could. So the first thing that happened, of course, was the massacres of some of the men who had been taken and marched into England in a deportation, but half of them, the 3,000 of them, were massacred. Those details about that come across in the war diaries as we go. But then the question is, what happens to the 10,000, 12,000 Greek women and children and old people that were still in Samsun? So they were fearing that they would be deported too, because in fact many places in Pontus they were already being deported, the non-combatants. Well, so when the news came out that the women and children had been ordered to be deported, then the admiral reports this by message to the Commander Bristol. There are two names here. Admiral Bristol and Commander Bristol were not related at all. But Commander Bristol reports to the admiral what has happened. But then he decides just before it takes place that he will send a ship, another destroyer, which happens to be in the harbor, and its captain, to take a letter, a handwritten letter. Most of what they do, it's of course by typewriter and so on, by message, but had to carry it by handwritten letter overnight by a fast ship from Samsun to Constantinople, where the admiral's headquarters was. And he decides he will write the admiral in no uncertain terms as to what's happening, but at the same time he has to be as tactful as he can. Basically, what he says is, we know it's a massacre, basically, essentially, is what is taking place here, this deportation of the women and children. Sooner or later, that half of them will die. The Turks, even we talk to, they know it's a massacre. So at a later date, perhaps when everything is known and people look back on it, and if we don't do something, will be accepted as being in the same place as the Germans, who were in Turkey and said nothing officially about the Armenian genocide. We'll be in the same place as that, and by implication, perhaps he was saying, Admiral Bristol, you'll be blamed for this too. He does it very tactfully, but he does it by this personal note. And by the way, this is after several other times that some kind of report of this kind is something like this had taken place. But he does this by the personal note, and he implies that the only thing you can do is really make a personal protest to Mustafa Kemal. And so he gets the admiral to do that. The admiral protests to Mustafa Kemal, and within a week and a half, I think it was, the nationalists had called off the deportation of the Samsun non-combatants, the women and children from Samsun. It didn't stop what was going through the rest of the province, but it did stop and perhaps save their lives because, in fact, the nationalists never dared to Admiral Bristol was a friend of theirs, and they never dared to really touch the Samsun Greeks again, and they were eventually, those 10,000 people, their lives were saved because they were eventually, after the episode at Smyrna, they were taken out of Turkey and became refugees, probably most of whom went to Greece.
There's another standout captain or officer that we encounter in the book, and it's Officer Leahy, who subsequently becomes a senior figure in the Roosevelt Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. Can you tell us a little bit about what his efforts during this that we encounter in the book to help save lives?
William Leahy was one of the most outstanding officers of World War II. In fact, he was the first officer, Navy or otherwise, to be promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, even before Nimitz. He was basically one of Roosevelt's, or perhaps Roosevelt's, chief or key advisor, the one he trusted most. He was a captain at this point. He was on a cruiser that came to Samsun, and it may have been sent by the admiral to show a force a little bit. It would happen just after he had asked Mustafa Kemal not to deport the women and children. In any case, he came and he saw what was going on and tried to talk to those Turks he saw and tried to get them to back off on what they did. One interesting thing, though, he did was he said in his personal diary that we do, what he said was, I could take under command the whole city with my guns on this cruiser. What that means is that he could probably have stopped if he had been at Smyrna later. He could have stopped, or though certainly the battleships which were there, the British had battleships at Smyrna later. They could have stopped the Turks from entering the city before they were all the Greeks and Armenians and other Christians were evacuated. So he was willing to consider something that Admiral Bristol would never have considered, nor did anybody else when the terrible fire at Smyrna and the terrible events took place there.
A lot of the information that the captains get when we read the book, we see that it comes from either Americans that are in the cities that have business interests, or it's from relief workers that are working further inland. And the efforts of the Near East relief are impressive, and I think a lot of us are familiar with some of what they were doing. But can you both, Savas and Bob, and I'll let Savas start off, can you tell us a little bit about the relief workers in general and what they were doing? And then I want to get into the details with Bob, because I know he's written on the matter. So if you could kick us off, Savas.
Yeah, I'd like to add something with regard to the presence of the American ships in the harbor of Samsun. In addition to what Bob was referring to, just the presence of the ships in the harbor was some sort of deterrence. In other words, because the Turks did very, very little within the city proper. Most of the massacres and other destructions of villages and burnings of villages took place outside, in other words, Samsun, because there were no foreign eyes, with the exception of the missionaries. And the American officers, Navy officers, were not allowed to get out of the city. In other words, they were limited. Once they got off the ship and came to the city, they were only allowed to stay within a certain area. In other words, enough so that they can have discussions with the local Turkish authorities. But the presence of the ships themselves was sufficient, in other words, to probably limit the massacres and destruction of villages, and possibly postpone a lot of the deportations that the Turks were planning, in other words. Now, with regard to your question about the Near East Relief, yeah, that was a great American organization that provided a lot of relief to Greek, Armenian, and to the Turks, in other words, that were suffering in the area. And they had stations not only in Samsun, but they had stations further inland in various towns. And it's amazing how these people volunteered, in other words, to serve under such difficult conditions, because it wasn't just the massacres and the deportations and all the other things that the Turks were doing. There was also a lot of disease, in other words, at the same time. So some of them actually contacted diseases and died of some of these, in other words, relief workers. And a lot of them actually were from here, the Midwest, for some unknown reason. In other words, they were originally, in other words, from the Midwest. So we think that they deserve a great respect and memory for what they had done.
Bob, can you give us a little bit more detail on the Near East Relief and its role, both in alleviating some of the suffering that was going on, but also in acting as a source of information for the naval officers? And tell us a little bit about its founding as well.
Well, it was founded because of the very terrible things that happened to the Armenians. And therefore, there were people already beginning, even before the end of the war, beginning to collect money for throughout America, from Harvard to all sorts of little towns, to help the starving Armenians and so on. But beyond that, they one of the reasons they have their records have been are so important is because they traveled inland. We're talking about deep inland into throughout Anatolia or Asia Minor or what we call Turkey today, deep inland to mission stations. American missionaries had been there for 100 years. And they had developed big mission stations which gave out medical relief, and which were educational. They had small colleges or junior colleges, probably as we would know them. And so when the Armenian genocide takes place and the Near East Relief people come inland, they come typically to those mission stations, and the missionaries become relief workers too, besides the missionaries already had knew the local languages, and they knew the people, and they knew the geography. And so they all became, and by the way, a lot of these missionaries, and a small majority of the Near East Relief workers were women. And sometimes you would have deep inland in Anatolia, you would have a little mission station where we hadn't seen any other Americans for a year, and there were 3 women working there to be intercessories on behalf of the Armenians and the Greeks with the Turks that are head of their organizations. One of them was Emily Thompson. I remember her, and she was trying to get some help for the little women and children, the little children who were coming on these deportation trails, and whose parents might have died, and they were all by themselves, and so on. So they would like to put them in a camp and treat them. And they finally, after weeks of trying to get the Turks to let them do this, they put them found a building. They began to treat them, and then within a day later, they came across them, and the Turks had sent them across the mountains. And there are all sorts of those kinds of gripping stories that they tell, and they tell those back when they get back to the Navy officers. And then, because some of them also didn't trust the admiral, they wouldn't talk to him, but they would come back to the Secretary of State office and leave their records with. So there were men and women both, and there were some doctors who were especially outspoken, and admiral didn't want to let their reports be heard, so they went through the British instead. So there was a contest between the Near East Relief and the admiral, especially on the fact that he wasn't letting these things be told. He wasn't letting anything get into the American newspapers. In the end, one American news writer went to Trebizond, heard out all sorts of things were happening there, and got his material in the Christian Science Monitor by going through British circuits rather than skirting the admiral. So it was a great organization. It has been written about, but the special heroism of the women there's never really a book about the women in Turkey in these days. It really is remarkable. American women in Turkey.
That seems maybe like a future project that can be explored possibly then. The heroic women in the Near East Relief that traveled throughout the Ottoman Empire to help many of these victims. I want to get to a certain theme that we see in the diaries as these U.S. captains and officers speak with their Turkish counterparts. And we see the Turkish arguments for the deportations. Can you tell us a little bit about, what were the Turks saying? How were they excusing what is clearly, a policy of extermination to the Americans? And give us a sense too, Savas, a little bit about what was behind, the policy of the genocide to begin.
Well, there were a few reasons that we get from the diaries. One of the reasons was the fact that supposedly the Greek minority was disloyal to the Turkish government of Kemal Atatürk and in general against the Turks. The other argument was that they were possibly they would possibly assist the Greek Navy in case it performed a landing in the area, because the Greek Navy was in the Black Sea at that time. So they were concerned supposedly that if the Greek Navy, at some point decides to do a landing of troops, that these people, the Greek minority, in other words, and especially the Greek Andartes, as we say, the guerrillas, would assist, in other words, the Navy. And another reason that they claim was the bombardment of Samsun and some other towns in the Black Sea, on the Black Sea coast, by the Greek Navy ships. So these are some of the reasons, and actually they were excuses. They were not actually reasons, because the Greek Navy was not equipped with ships. In other words, ships that were meant for a landing. There were destroyers and smaller ships. So that was not a possible scenario, in other words. The fact that the bombardments also was not a good reason, because the plan to exterminate the Greeks, basically by deporting them, massacring them, and doing all kinds of other things, had already preceded the first bombardment, which took place in June 9 of 1921 at the town of Vineboli on the Black Sea coast. So that was not a valid reason, in other words. So in general, the reasons and the fact that they were disloyal, I think they surmised that from the fact that when the Greek army had some successes in the war against the Turkish army, well, the Greek minority and the Greek people in Asia Minor were kind of happy about that, and I guess the Turks saw that, and they didn't like that. So the reasons for the deportations and all the other things that they committed against the Greek minority was not really reasons. They were pretexts, in other words.
Yeah, you mentioned that they're pretexts just now. Bob, can you give us a picture of what, I mean, because we've seen this policy put in place by the Young Turks during World War I, and it started in 1914 even. So well before there's any talk of a Greek landing in Asia Minor. Can you give us some of the factors behind why the Ottomans and then subsequently the Kemalists pursued this policy of genocide?
That's a good question. It's certainly true what Savas is saying, that those were the reasons that are brought up, and they're brought up in the diaries, and some of the naval officers listen to them. They say, except for humanity, issues of humanity, he makes a good case. He talks to a Turkish colonel in the military who wanted to talk to him about it. And one of the things, of course, is that might in general work towards the guerrillas. There were Greek guerrillas in the mountains, and they'd sent out or left in order not to be killed in the labor battalions and so on. That might work for military folk, but it doesn't work to tell the reason why you would kill old people and women and children in the process. It's a good question, and I would say that not all the Turks, in fact, appreciated this policy of extermination. One thing we do discover in the text is that several prominent Turks, businessmen, others in Samsun, sent protests to Mustafa Kemal saying, "Don't do these things. Don't do these things." Well, among other things, you destroyed the economic viability of Samsun. All the Greeks were the people who were the businessmen. But beyond that, it's a terrible thing to do. And others would come into the office of the American businessman there and say, and with tears in their eyes, hearing about the terrible things, the rapes and the killings, the massacres outright, and with tears in their eyes, because these things were seemed to be habitual. They seemed to be habitual, and they seemed to be not blamed by anybody, although they were blamed by many of the better Turks. I say part of it is habitual, and I would say I'm sort of talking around your question. Why they did it? It's a mystery, I suspect.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
If we look at the bigger picture, the Turks, when they started losing the areas in Europe, like specifically in the Balkans, after the Balkan Wars, they started to get concerned that eventually they might lose Asia Minor itself. So in order to preserve, in other words, that area, they figured, and I think with the help of the Germans, that they have to get rid of the minorities. So they put this plan together that, look, we got to do something like that. And they agreed, I guess, with what the Germans proposed. And so they started first with the Greeks in 1914 in Eastern Thrace and Western Asia Minor. And then they proceeded with the Armenians in 1915. And later on continued with the rest of the Greeks in Asia Minor and with the Pontic Greeks. So it was a bigger plan to get rid of the minorities in Asia Minor so that they can create their own nation state of basically Muslims, and eventually they would name them all Turks. So
yeah,
that's something else.
Turkification that we've heard about.
So, and that's what they tried to do also with Muslims too, like the Kurds. But they are having these problems now. In other words, they kept the Kurds, but they try to Turkify them, and that plan is not working very well, as we all know.
Yeah. So, as we know, in 1922, in September, I want to bring our conversation to a conclusion. In September 1922, we see the Great Fire of Smyrna and obviously the defeat of the Greek army completely in Asia Minor, and this moment essentially marks the end of a Greek presence that lasted millennium in Asia Minor, both on the Aegean coast and on the northern coast of Asia Minor in the Pondos region. Can you give us a brief summary of the aftermath? What happened after the genocide? Where did most of the Pondian Greeks and the Asia Minor Greeks end up? And if there is an estimate, can you give us the numbers as well? And this is a question for both of you, so I'll let either one of you take it.
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, it's estimated that the Greeks in Asia Minor, because the Ottoman censuses were not accurate, so it's estimated that the Greeks in Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace were approximately 1.2 million. From those 1.2 million, I'm sorry, I meant to say 2.2 million. From that 2.2 million, approximately 1,100,000 were exchanged, in other words, and went to Greece basically by different means. So these were the numbers. So if you just do a rough, in other words, subtraction, right? You get some idea of what the difference is. Anyway, now with regard to the Pontic Greeks only, they were approximately 400, and there are different numbers, various numbers quoted, but I think the true number was closer to 450,000, the Pontic Greeks, out of which approximately 200,000, between 200 and 250, eventually, in other words, came to Greece after the exchange of populations, with the exchange of populations. So if you do if you subtract one from the other, you can, estimate what the number of Greeks that perished. Of course, the official number is 353,000, but these are all approximate numbers, as I said, because the Ottoman Empire censuses were not very accurate.
We've got a couple questions in the comments, and I think they raise an interesting question on how we remember the genocide. And one of the questions is, and I think I'll direct this one to Bob, Maria Lambros asks us, she wonders if Turkey will ever admit to this part of their history and continue to leave it out of their history books. Do you think that we might get to a point where this would change and Turkey would admit to this crime and include it in its history curriculum?
I can answer that specifically as to now. I talked on our book at the conference.
I think we have a problem with his side of the interview.
Sorry, Bob. Would you mind starting over?
Yes, I talked in Athens. I was invited to talk at Athens this last year. The Greek government, including the Greek Prime Minister and the Greek President, the President invited us to his palace and so on, the speakers, and we talked about the genocide and what would happen what had happened and all ways to prevent it. And the Turkish government replied in a communique, in a public relations answer, that there was that there were no killings of the Turks, of the Greeks by the Turks, but the Greeks had killed the Turks. The other way around, in other words. In fact, there were some episodes of that. We know that, but of course the grand. So, but their ideas. So as of right now, they're whitewashing it, and I don't have an answer. I'm not a politician. Don't have an answer. There are some Greek scholars. There are some Turkish scholars who've come to this country and who have written books on the side of a genuine appreciation of what happened there. So there are some others in Turkey who speak out to a degree on this topic, but the official position of the government is, of course, that Turkey was not at fault.
Savas,
the nationalists and Mao were not at fault.
I personally don't think that Turkey will ever, in other words, admit to those crimes, and I think one of the reasons is because the Armenians, the Greeks, the Greek aspect of the genocide is kind of settled by the Treaty of Lausanne, and Greeks cannot claim any claim, in other words, property, lost property, because that was all settled. However, the Armenians, they were not part of the Lausanne Treaty, so they can claim, in other words, compensation for all the property that left behind and was seized by the Turks. So that's a big hurdle for the Turks, I think. And plus the fact that they are not very, with some exceptions, they're not the kinds of, they don't have the level of, in other words, personal they're not the people that will accept very easily that this was a crime against these minorities, and it was actually a genocide. So I don't believe that this will ever happen.
There was another question as well that came in from Matt Costa, and he asks why do we talk about separate genocides in Anatolia when it seems that there's obviously a big link between, what happened to the Armenians, what happened to the Greeks, and what happened to the Assyrians, almost being, part of the same genocide, essentially. And I know that in the legislation, in the bill that the Senate passed and the House passed recognizing the Armenian genocide, it included language for the Greeks, Assyrians, and other Christian groups as well. Can you shed some light on that? Why do we talk about it in different ways? And I think even among the Greek community, we talk about a Pontian Greek genocide, and then there's a separate date for the Asia Minor Greek genocide, and then a separate date for the genocide of the Greeks of Thrace.
Can I answer that?
Sure.
It's because, if Bob agrees, it's because, first of all, within the Greek community, it's because the Pontic Greeks started first, in other words, their activism for the recognition of the genocide. Unfortunately, the rest of Asia Minor Greeks were not as active in that respect. So That's how it started. In other words, it was recognized in the Greek Parliament by the Greek Parliament, the Pantheon genocide, Pontian Greek genocide. I think it was in 1994. Then the Parliament recognized the genocide of the remaining Asia Minor Greeks later on. So we have at least two dates, in other words. And of course, there's efforts to unite, in other words, both groups under one umbrella. And that's why the reason the title of our book is the Greek Genocide. Doesn't say the Pontic Greek Genocide, because we want to, in other words, include all the other groups, the Eastern Thrace Greeks as well as the Ionian Greeks. And now, with regard to the three genocides, the Christian genocide, as we call it, well, again, the Armenians started first with their activism. They were very successful. And then gradually, the Greeks started with the Pontic Greeks first. And now we realize that, wait a minute, now this is one genocide. We should work together. And if we are to get recognition, we have to work together, and with the Assyrians as well. And so there are efforts, and I think you guys are involved to some extent with your collaboration with the Armenian in Washington, correct?
Yep,
and
with
you
the Armenian National Committee.
Last year, that resolution that recognized the Armenian genocide also made a reference to the Greek genocide, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're starting to recognize that if we work together, we will have a better outcome. In other words, hopefully the recognition of all the genocide, or the three genocides, is one genocide, the Christian genocide. And so let's hope that this will happen, in other words, soon.
Let's echo, I think, the sentiment of, as we wrap up the conversation, that of never again, and ensuring that people are educated and know what happened so that we can't repeat these terrible crimes again. And that's why I want to thank you both for writing this book, putting this together, doing the research. Professor Shank, it's been great to have you with us. Really a pleasure to hear about these incredible stories of these naval officers who sometimes put their careers on the line to do what was right. Savas, thank you again for all your tireless efforts to document these war diaries and get this off the ground. And I want to recommend to everybody, if you haven't had a chance to check out the book, please take a look online. You can probably order it. I know Amazon and other places will have a link. But take a look at it, read it. There's a lot of great material in here, and it'll serve as a beacon, I think, of that phrase, and give meaning to never again as we move forward. Thank you both again for joining us, and I think that'll wrap up our conversation.
We want to thank you too, and Hulk, and you and Andy too.
Thank you very much, and thank you all to our viewers. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.